In my opinion, the turning point in the 2000s was the Maidan coup, and from then on, the focus increasingly shifted toward portraying Putin as the enemy. Putin as the enemy of humanity, as the embodiment of absolute evil. This has become firmly established in public debate in Germany since then. No one knows what should happen in a post-war period when it might be necessary to negotiate with Putin again. Because if you're supposed to negotiate with the embodiment of evil, that's quite a difficult thing to do.
Hello everyone, Pascal here from Neutrality Studies, and today I have an entire panel with me. I'm talking with Stefan Luft, Jan Opielka, and Jürgen Wendler, the authors of the book, With Russia for a Change in Policy, in which the three authors strongly advocate for a complete overhaul of German-Russian relations. That's what we want to discuss today. So gentlemen, welcome. Thank you very much. Thank you for agreeing to join us, and also for your book, in which you outline, over several periods and in 3 rather long essays, everything that is currently going wrong in German and European relations with Russia. May I perhaps start by asking you, Mr. Luft? You initiated the book project, as I understand it. What is the motivation behind this work?
There was a first volume in 2023, Ukraine War, Why Europe Needs a New Policy of Détente. The response to it was positive, but there is an invisible wall. The major leading media, the established media, generally ignore such statements completely, and that was the case with us as well. However, I was very impressed by the culture of debate, and I felt that it was time to publicly voice dissent once again, especially since, in my view, militarization and war propaganda in the media have become even more drastic over the past 1 or 2 years.
This militarization has also increased in German-speaking Europe, at least from my perspective. Unfortunately, Austria and Switzerland are part of this as well. The media reports naturally follow suit. So, Mr. Luft, what do you actually perceive as the main change when you compare how the discourse was 3 years ago, when the war reached its current scale, when it all began, and where we stand now, in 2025? And your book was only published on July 21st, 2025.
From my perspective, the turning point was marked by the Operations Plan Germany, which to this day has not been published and is only known in abstract terms. This Operations Plan Germany serves to militarize society. The military and others are able, with its help, to introduce this mindset into society. In my view, that was the decisive turning point. The debate about what each country must contribute, from daycare centers to businesses, all the way to civil society, which must ensure that 800,000 soldiers can be brought to the eastern flank within a few months. In my opinion, such concrete debates had not taken place before.
There is also the term war readiness, which is now experiencing a resurgence in Germany and Europe in general. Perhaps, Mr. Wendler, you wrote a long section of the book under the title The West at a Crossroads. Could you perhaps describe this crossroads a bit?
Yes, perhaps. I believe that if you want to honestly look at the problems of the current situation, then the war in Ukraine needs to be seen in a larger context. And I'd like to briefly describe this larger context. If you go far back, half a century, to the book The Limits to Growth by the Club of Rome, it was said that we are in a situation of planetary boundaries, where we have to think about resource consumption, waste, and so on, where there are absolute limits. At the same time, there is the situation that we understand progress as something that improves people's lives, where life expectancy increases, and so on. All these things.
Haben wir das eigentlich erreicht? Wo stehen wir?
And the question is, have we actually achieved that? Where do we stand today? And I have been thinking about the question, where does the Western world actually stand? Does the Western world have anything to offer in terms of these goals? Where does it stand itself? And I'd like to mention 3 points when considering, for example, what distinguished the British Empire and what characterizes the US's dominance, its hegemony. There are 3 essential points. These powers were originally characterized by strong industrial production, a powerful navy to control global trade routes, and a strong currency of global significance. And here we already see today's problem.
Und da sehen wir schon das heutige Problem. Die Vormacht USA.
The dominant power, the USA, and I ultimately consider the European Union and the NATO countries as subordinate to this dominant power, has enormous problems. Industrial production in the US, as we all know, we see the digital sector, but overall, and this is exactly what Mr. Trump has been addressing, has declined. The US is facing industrial problems. With their aircraft carriers, they will no longer be able to dominate the world. This has been proven at the latest by the hypersonic missiles we have seen, for example, in the Israel-Iran conflict. Regarding the dollar, we see that the BRICS countries are making efforts to undermine the dollar as an instrument of power, through sanctions, through expropriation of property, and so on, ultimately to abuse it. This is now being countered by the BRICS countries, which are trying to settle things among themselves in their own currencies. That is the external situation of the Western world with its position of dominance. But we are not only dealing with the external, we also have the internal. And there we see that it concerns the demographic situation as well. The US makes up 4% of the world's population. So there is actually no realistic way to rule the world. Samuel Huntington already described this. The economic momentum is not enough for that. But it's not just that. In the US, we see polarization, we see society falling apart, more and more poor and rich people who ultimately rule, the collapse of the middle class, and we see the same situation in Europe, the same development. Maybe not so strongly here and there yet, but everything is moving in that direction. So one has to ask, where does the Western world stand? Outwardly, what positive impulses does it provide for global development? That's one thing. And what positive impulses does it give to its own populations? Is the only answer now that, as in the European Union with the Digital Services Act, we suddenly find ourselves confronted with attempts to undermine diversity of opinion, to combat so-called disinformation, to continually narrow the corridor of acceptable opinions? Is that the answer? Is that supposed to be the answer? It won't be. It will lead to significant problems even within Western societies. And against this background, the West must consider, where does it actually stand, what do we want, and what positive contributions can we make?
Und das ist auch der Punkt, wo ihre Kapitel zueinander sprechen. Also
And that's also the point where your chapters speak to each other. So this increasing militarization of Germany, the militarization of thinking, and the authoritarian tendencies in the West, also in the language used by current politics that we're observing, or how there's an attempt to convince us that we must perceive an enemy as an enemy and prepare ourselves for that. And in 2027, they'll come. And by 2029, at the latest, the war will be here. So this rhetoric is escalating at the moment. Mr. Opielka, in your section you also try to describe how Central and Eastern Europe could on the one hand be a bridge, but on the other hand is currently being barricaded as a wall. Where do you see things heading?
Wo sehen Sie, wo die Reise hingeht?
Ja, die Reise geht eindeutig, wenn man
Yes, if you look at the countries of Central and Eastern Europe as a whole, the direction is clearly toward a fortress mentality. But you can see 2 different approaches, if you will. If you look at the extreme examples of Hungary on one side and Poland on the other. You just spoke about the militarization of Germany, and Mr. Luft also talked about war readiness and so on. If you look at Poland in this regard, You have to imagine this militarization and war mentality multiplied by 3.
Nochmal hoch 3 vorstellen. Und zwar einmal, was die Medien angeht.
First of all, regarding the media, how things are being conveyed, what is supposedly threatening Poland, or in fact all the Western NATO countries, but also regarding politics. And at the end of the day, all parties are on the same page that the country needs to massively rearm. It's no coincidence that Poland is now the country that has spent the most on armament for the past 2 years. So this 5% target that NATO has now decided on, that the European NATO countries should also reach this goal, Poland is already working toward it. This year, Poland will spend 4.7% of its gross domestic product, and that is by far the highest among NATO countries. The discussion is about how, a few days ago, Prime Minister Tusk stated that Polish intelligence services have concluded that Russia could be ready to attack one of the Baltic states as early as 2027, not just in 2029 or 2030. The situation in Poland, including the social climate and the mood being stirred up there, which, by the way, is similar to what's happening in the Baltic states, is extremely tense. On one hand, Poland is practically the prime example of a fortress. On the other hand, you have Hungary, and I want to emphasize this again. Hungary is a country with 10 million inhabitants that over the past 10 years, I think everyone in the world, or at least in Europe, knows the name Orbán and knows what he stands for. And even if one can view his policies very critically, and I do, regarding his domestic views and his playing with and fueling nationalism as well as his handling of refugees, when it comes to his position toward Russia and Ukraine, there are elements of what I mean could actually serve as a bridge, because Orbán is essentially, if you will, pursuing a policy that has been described as a multi-vector policy for Ukraine. That means, given the situation, namely, being between East and West, Central Europe, if you will, one has to establish connections in all directions. And these are both political and, of course, economic connections. And that could actually be the model for the Central and Eastern European states, with which they can do best, not just in terms of security policy, but also economically. Yes, and in this respect, if you will, this is the counter-model, that a country of 10 million like Hungary is practically pursuing this policy. That's not insignificant. And Hungary, for example, is also trying to expand its relations with China. China is also investing heavily. And Hungary is, of course, also trying not to let its relations with Russia break off. At the same time, Hungary, for example, gets its weapons from Germany. There is now a large, massive production of tanks that has started up in Hungary. So, in principle, if you will, from a national perspective, this is a policy that is very much guided by interests and indeed quite intelligent. And I try to imagine this purely as a scenario, because of course it's unlikely, and it won't happen, if the countries of the Central and Eastern European region were to adopt a similar position to Hungary, and to some extent, as Slovakia is now doing. Namely, to think in a multi-vectoral way, if you will, looking both east and west, primarily of course toward the west, but without severing ties to the east, they could actually play an important role. Unfortunately, as it stands, because their brother state Poland, at the forefront, leans toward America and the West, and does so unconditionally, and acts in a completely anti-Russian manner, they have become a fortress, and if you will, have thereby diminished their status and reduced their political influence.
And
the crazy thing about this whole dynamic we're in is that the primary fear being stoked is only making things worse. The idea that you can have a relationship with the other side that isn't confrontational and thereby gain security, that idea is currently gone. And I always get a bit nervous. Not nervous, but it makes me... I always wonder, how can I explain this to people when they say that with Russia and China, you can only ensure your security through strength? Through deterrence. I always ask myself, how does Mongolia do it? Mongolia only has two neighbors, China and Russia.
Nur zwei Nachbarn, China und Russland, und die Mongolei hat keine Angst, weder vom einen noch vor dem anderen.
And Mongolia is not afraid, neither of one nor the other, because it has good relations with both. And Mongolia is a democracy, a country that is becoming more and more democratic. And Russia and China are Russia and China. But at the moment, Europeans have the idea that security can only be achieved through deterrence, and that this is exactly what leads to a spiral that makes everything worse. So only Hungary in Eastern Europe has a different approach. Maybe an open question, Mr. Luft, first. When did we lose this way of thinking, that you can also be secure by trying to make friends instead of perceiving others as enemies?
Die anderen als Feinde wahrzunehmen.
I think, first of all, during the Cold War, the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact were perceived as the enemy. That is undoubtedly the case. Then came Gorbachev, then the fall, the decline, the disappearance of the Iron Curtain, and the collapse of the Soviet Union and the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact. Those were years, I would say, from the 1990s to the early 2000s. That was when Putin spoke in the German Bundestag and gave a much-noticed speech. Although, with the knowledge we have today, you could already observe back then who had particularly frozen facial expressions and didn't applaud among the parliamentary groups. And that was the Greens. In particular, Joschka Fischer and the Greens now stand at the forefront alongside the CDU and CSU, and of course also the SPD and FDP, against Russia and against Putin. I believe this shift took place in the 2000s, when it became increasingly clear that the US was aiming to contain and possibly partition, that is, divide up Russia. This enemy image grew stronger and stronger, and the expansion of NATO, which Russia perceived as encirclement, was not seen as a problem at all in the Western and also in the German public. NATO was considered a force for peace, and it supposedly had no bad intentions anyway. And nobody really knows why Russia is getting so worked up about it. In my opinion, the turning point in the 2000s was the Maidan coup. And more, things started moving toward the image of Putin as the enemy. Putin as the enemy of humanity, as the embodiment of absolute evil that has become firmly established in public debate in Germany since then. Nobody knows what is supposed to happen in a post-war period when it might be necessary to negotiate with Putin again. Because if you're supposed to negotiate with the embodiment of evil, that's pretty difficult. And these reservations were raised early on, but the debate hasn't changed. The perception hasn't changed. I largely agree with what Mr. Luft said, that this intensified in the 2000s and that the rift became increasingly pronounced. But it actually began in the 1990s, namely with the possibility that emerged in the early 1990s that Europe could even become a non-aligned zone with a new security architecture, such as the Partnership for Peace, which could theoretically have been expanded and was on the agenda at the time. In other words, the NATO initiative, which was officially announced for the first time by Bill Clinton in 1996, to admit the first countries from Eastern and Central Eastern Europe within 3 years by the 50th anniversary of NATO's founding. That was essentially the nucleus, and it was already growing then. He wasn't as confrontational back then, of course. Russia was already opposed at the time, but was also simply aware of its own weakness and knew there was nothing it could do. But practically since then, policy has developed in such a way that NATO expansion has continued. Then in 2004, for the first time, including states that had previously been part of the Soviet Union, namely the Baltic states. And to emphasize the role of Central and Eastern Europe here once again, this policy was possible not because the countries were somehow forced to join NATO. They wanted to, of course. there was also a majority in favor among the respective populations. But in Hungary, there was a referendum, and in the other countries, there were at least polls that suggested this. And of course, the West, especially the US, took advantage of the fact that public sentiment in these countries was very anti-Russian, and they also encouraged it. So these feelings of threat from Russia, or previously the Soviet Union and then Russia as its successor state, which are quite understandable from a historical perspective, were exploited by the West, particularly the US. And yes, to return to the question, the confrontational stance was a gradual process that, in my opinion, already began in the 1990s and then intensified accordingly.
Dazu vielleicht noch eine Ergänzung.
Perhaps an additional point on this. If you go back to the 2+4 treaty, which ultimately marked the end of the post-war period for Germany, it explicitly states only peace shall emanate from German soil, only peace. And it also explicitly says that actions likely to disturb international peace, the international order of peace, especially the preparation of a war of aggression, which is specified again, so actions that are likely to disturb peace are unconstitutional and punishable by law. From this, especially considering German history and the guilt towards Soviet citizens, 27 million dead in the Soviet Union during World War II, it follows that we are obliged to try to remain open to all sides and to build bridges rather than walls.
Allen Seiten hin offen zu sein und eher Brücken zu bauen. Das tun wir aber nicht. Eben diese Brückenfunktion, die Jan
But we are not doing that. Precisely this bridging function, which Jan Opielka just described for the Central and Eastern European countries, is especially necessary for Germany. And Germany is not doing that at all. We can see that right now. We are now supporting the industrial policy of the USA by buying armaments there. We are now sourcing our energy from the USA. That was just agreed upon again by Ms. von der Leyen and Mr. Trump. So we are pursuing a policy that is exclusively in the interest of the hegemon. That needs to be stated clearly. And for me, the question arises, are the USA really capable of reconsidering this position, of rethinking this approach? These are questions that people like Jeffrey Sachs keep raising.
Leute wie Jeffrey Sachs immer wieder in den Raum stellen. Darauf kommt es eigentlich an, im Sinne eines globalen Miteinanders.
That's what really matters in terms of global cooperation. In fact, here in Europe, we are witnessing this massive creation of an enemy image. That means there is an attempt. Just a few years ago, according to surveys, the German population mostly wanted to have a good relationship with Russia. Our history also demands that. And what is being done at the moment? Russia is being elevated to the status of the villain, which of course does not reflect reality. It's about interests in this world, and those need to be viewed objectively. So it is absolutely necessary to look at reality in the West as well. And the reality in the Western world, both in terms of its possibilities as a hegemon and its internal conditions, is not positive.
How do you view the construction of an enemy image, which in my opinion largely originates from Germany, that is, from a German discourse? Specifically, this strange positioning of Putin as Hitler, as the new Hitler. And Hitler was, after all, a German phenomenon, and also a Central European phenomenon. That should not be forgotten. There was collaboration as well, even across borders. Now, for Central Europe to presume to take this figure, who is considered the embodiment of absolute evil, and that is accepted in Germany, Switzerland, Austria, and so on, that what happened was simply evil, and to now project that onto Russia, and use this rhetoric to explain why we all have to be against Hitler again, only now Hitler is supposedly in Moscow. I don't know if any of you would like to comment on that.
In Moskau. Ich weiß nicht, wer von Ihnen vielleicht sich dazu äußert.
Vielleicht, wenn ich dazu noch was sagen darf. Also, Herr Karaganov,
if I may add something to that. Mr. Karaganov, a leading thinker in Russia, said several years ago that he assumed there would be a new division of the world. If you look at what Mr. Schwab wrote right after the start of the coronavirus crisis in his book, The Great Reset, he wrote that trends would intensify, especially the decoupling from China. That means there was obviously already a trend a preparation for a new division. Why might this preparation have been initiated?
Warum könnte diese Vorbereitung initiiert worden sein? Ich vermute, das ist meine Hypothese, dass die westliche Welt
I suspect, this is my hypothesis, that the Western world is aware that, as the leading power, it is facing global problems due to economic and demographic dynamics. Samuel Huntington already predicted this in the 1990s, and the response to this has been to close ranks and ultimately accept this decoupling. In my view, however, that is the wrong path. I believe we should seek global solutions for global problems. And that also requires a realistic understanding of our own role and strengths. That's my perspective on this.
Das ist meine Sicht dazu.
Darf ich noch einen Punkt dazu sagen, der aus meiner Sicht
May I add one more point? From my perspective, a certain anti-Russian sentiment also plays a role, as well as anti-Slavic attitudes that go back to the 19th century and are being revived more or less unconsciously. For example, the image that was painted of the Russian army in 2022, that they are completely incompetent, totally under-equipped, constantly drunk, and not to be taken seriously at all. In my opinion, that was a point where it became clear that these stereotypes were being referenced, stereotypes that were also perpetuated during the Third Reich. And that's why it's a Manichaean worldview, a dualistic worldview.
Eine dualistische Weltsicht. Das eine, die eine Seite, die verkörpern.
One side embodies evil, and the other side, coincidentally us, in quotation marks, meaning NATO and the West, the USA, we embody Western values and therefore the good. However, anyone who pursues such a policy, a values-based policy, will eventually trigger a global civil war, because we encounter many countries, not just China and India, that do not share these specifically Western values. And if we now say first that we label everyone a dictator, which the former German Foreign Minister Baerbock was particularly fond of doing, and then possibly impose sanctions on them, disguising our own economic interests in the process, this approach no longer works and is ultimately disastrous.
Kommt nicht mehr an und ist auf Dauer verheerend.
Regarding what you asked about Hitler and why this comparison is made, I think I would underline what Mr. Luft said and put it even more strongly. By invoking the greatest dictator in world history and the embodiment of evil, as you put it, which is certainly a fair characterization, considering what happened in the Holocaust, including the destruction of other peoples, in Poland, in Russia, and so on, by using this most extreme example, one automatically places oneself on the side of the righteous, the good. And this is where this Manichaeism, this rigidity, is expressed, as well as the exclusion of politics, if you will. The exclusion of politics in this sense. Politics is something that is always in conflict and never truly resolved, but always has to be managed. I think that's what is being expressed here. And the second thing that is so disastrous about this is that it causes us to overlook the fact that there are actually many more parallels between this war, or more generally, the current situation in Europe, but also in other parts of the world, and the First World War. The parallels are not only visible on the battlefields, and so to speak, in the pact that is being made. Well, of course, it's not a pact, because Russia is now stronger. But this forward movement, or these territorial gains that have been made there over 3 years, are not that significant. So the parallels can already be seen on the battlefield. But on the other hand, this conflict that is manifesting here is much more reminiscent of the great power conflict that already existed before the First World War. Namely, what will the future division of spheres of influence in the world look like? And by referring to Hitler, people are ignoring what is actually wrong and also absurd.
How should we best deal with this now? Well, we actually managed to move away in Central Europe from the 1990s, which from a European perspective were extremely positive and hopeful years, and during which we also had a Russia that wanted to cooperate with the West. We can see how, by 2025, this has basically turned into the opposite. And Europe, should the US ever pull the plug, would be left on its own. Although pull the plug might not be the right way to put it, because right now you can clearly see how the US is playing with Europe, and in my view, also playing Europe off, especially in these conflicts and enemy images. How do we get out of this? How does Europe get out of this mess without a third European war? Because the First and Second World Wars were European wars that, due to colonial dominance, became world wars.
How do we get out of this? I think, yes, Stefan, you go first.
Ja, Stefan, sag du zuerst.
No.
Ach so, also ich glaube, Markus,
Oh, well, I think a fundamental question is, first of all, for the US itself. The US is obviously also divided when it comes to its position in the world. I think it would actually be wise to listen to people like Jeffrey Sachs. The US is basically on an island surrounded by oceans to the west and east. They are not threatened. That's 340 million people, a large population. They have their own resources. They are capable of asserting themselves. They don't need to cover the whole world with military bases in order to pursue their economic goals.
Ökonomischen Ziele durchzusetzen. Sprich, die USA müssten in meinen Augen wirklich...
In my view, the US really needs to start thinking about what role it wants to play in the world. As a hegemon, it won't be able to maintain its position as the sole world power in the long run. That's not realistic. I believe that the so-called multipolar world is at least in the process of emerging. In fact, I think it's already here. China is so far ahead technologically today. When it comes to manufacturing, China is so strong. It's absolutely necessary to seek cooperation here, and we have to ask ourselves what the foundations for that could be.
Man muss sich die Frage stellen, was können dafür Grundlagen sein? In meinen Augen, ich persönlich plädiere ausdrücklich.
In my view, I personally strongly advocate for a return to the UN Charter. It offers good approaches for how we should interact with one another. In this sense, by the way, we don't see our book as just with Russia. You could also title it with China or with anyone else. We are opposed to exclusion. We take a positive approach to diplomacy, talking to each other, seeking solutions. That is really the goal. And this applies especially to Europe. In my opinion, it is even a historical responsibility.
Herr Luft.
Wie kommen wir da wieder raus? Das ist eine Frage, die ich mir auch...
Mr. Luft, how do we get out of this? That's a question I've been asking myself for a long time as well. In 2022, I was still advocating for making negotiation attempts, talking to Putin, launching German-French initiatives. Today, the costs of this war for Putin have risen so enormously that the likelihood of him engaging in diplomatic initiatives, which are coming far too late, is very low. We have a political elite in Germany and in the EU that is extremely fixated on war. If you listen to the Foreign Affairs representative Kallas, who has also picked up on this thesis from US think tanks that Russia should be broken up, then you have to say that, in my view, the chances of a peaceful resolution to this conflict are very slim, especially since I've analyzed this for Germany in my book.
Fast alle Akteure, Medien, Kirchen,
almost all actors, media, churches, some unions, almost all parties, the only party that explicitly says it is against war and against rearmament, did not make it back into the Bundestag. Well, the Left Party is also trying to move in that direction. But otherwise, there is a very, very broad coalition. Even in the media, there is a form of self-alignment that is quite impressive. And in this respect, I think that things will only really start to change when the first draft notices for sons land on the tables at home. Then maybe even the last person will realize that things are getting serious.
Der Letzte begreifen, dass es ernst wird. Ich glaube, dass viele immer noch in einer Parallelwelt leben.
I think that many people are still living in a parallel world. Something is brewing, and it's happening at an incredible speed, with enormous momentum. And from my perspective, most people just go on with their lives. While 50% still say they don't want a war with Russia, the political developments are heading in a completely different direction. So, I don't believe that young Germans, I've seen this myself at the university here in Bremen, are really willing to go to war, especially not if you draw a comparison to World War I. People are not going to march off to war with bands playing.
Man wird nicht in den Krieg ziehen mit klingendem Spiel.
I just wanted to address what you said. You mentioned that if America pulls the plug. I think that's exactly the kind of scenario that's hanging in the air, that America could withdraw, which is of course being massively fueled now under Trump, because he himself says he won't protect Europe, and so on. But I think we need to distinguish between what Trump himself says and what some of his successors or his inner circle are saying. And on the other hand, what America's genuine interest is and always has been. And that, of course, was to have influence in Europe. That was the prominent geostrategist George Friedman who said that. Basically, ever since entering World War I and World War II and so on, the interest has been to have a foothold in Europe and to prevent Europe from allying itself with Russia in any way. He originally meant this in relation to Germany, but of course by now it applies to all of Europe. So America will, notwithstanding any claims to the contrary, this is my thesis, not pull the plug if things get serious, because Europe is extremely important to America. So, if we imagine that America were to lose its influence over Europe, then America would be left alone on its own continent, with no access to the Eurasian continent, where, essentially, history has always been decided and will continue to be decided in the future. So I think this is a scenario that is being used as a threat, and which Europeans, at least parts of the population, follow in their fears. But in principle, I don't think it's very realistic, because the Americans can't just withdraw that easily. Regarding the core interests, or where things should go from here, I wanted to add, I think the crucial point is that the majority of people in Europe recognize that this is truly our genuine interest. And our genuine interest is that we live together with Russia on one continent. We are, as the philosopher Peter Sloterdijk puts it, basically the foothills of Asia. In other words, we are not really a continent ourselves, we are just the western tip of the great Eurasian continent. And we simply have to find a peace order, a security architecture, in which we can live together in the future. And only when the majority of people become aware of this interest, this core interest, can there be an impact on the political elites who currently do not represent this interest.
I
want to explicitly emphasize again what John Opielka said. The USA, if I follow the discussions of recent months, is withdrawing from Europe. In fact, that is the crucial question. If you look at geopolitics, the history of geopolitics, it's not just George Friedman, but for example, there was a man named Nicholas Spykman during World War II who said that for the USA, it is of massive interest to also control the rimlands of Eurasia. If you look at that, the importance of the Baltic Sea, the Black Sea, now the areas around China, the South China Sea, then we see U.S. interests in being the dominant power here, in playing a role here, are still very much present. And what has actually changed, this is what Mr. Trump has achieved, is that now, as Europeans, we are buying armaments in the U.S., and we are taking on the responsibility for armaments for the U.S. in order to secure their dominance in Eurasia. I think it is completely unrealistic to believe that the U.S. would withdraw from Eurasia. But that is precisely the question the U.S. should be asking itself, to consider what it wants to be in the world, whether it wants to continue this approach, also by taking advantage of the Europeans. That is what is happening right now. And as Europeans, we are experiencing immense losses in prosperity, and our societies are facing more and more problems. Incidentally, as I mentioned earlier, polarization, all these things. By the way, I also believe that societies, including in Germany, are not at all willing to go to war for what is happening here and what politicians would like. I don't believe that.
Da bin ich mit Ihnen absolut einverstanden. Das Problem, das wir jetzt auch
I absolutely agree with you on that. The problem we've now seen in Ukraine as well is that you can have 70% of the population in favor of peace, people who also elected Mr. Zelensky because they wanted peace with Russia. And yet you can still drive that many people into a war if you manage to get the elites on your side, and then create a situation where the first shot is fired by the other side.
In der erste Schuss von der anderen Seite kommt. Und wenn man sich im Moment anschaut, wie Europa...
And if you look at the moment at how Europe, and specifically Germany, is now delivering weapons, probably Taurus missiles, that will likely end up destroying something in Russia at some point, and how efforts are currently underway to eventually provoke an attack from Russia on Rheinmetall or something similar, just so it can be claimed that we were attacked without provocation. So the spiral, not just the spiral, but the attempt to push the other side so far that you have everything you need politically to send your own sons and daughters to the Eastern Front once again. Unfortunately, that's what's happening right now. And this game with Ukraine has already worked, instrumentalizing an entire country. The question for us other Europeans is, how do we make sure that the whole continent doesn't get dragged into such a war? Any ideas?
Ideen.
Vielleicht dazu aber auch noch mal.
Perhaps to address this once more, we have seen the conflict between Israel and Iran. There, the West actually experienced that a ceasefire eventually came about. That was also related to the realization of what Iran was militarily capable of. I think every politician in Europe should understand that you cannot fight a nuclear war. And not just a nuclear war. The new weapon systems, the entire war technology has changed. You can see that. There is a revolution, as the war in Ukraine has shown. We also see hypersonic weapons. These are completely new situations. And politicians in Europe should also recognize that they cannot and should not engage in such a conflict with high-tech states like Russia, China, and also Iran. And then you have to look for other solutions.
Herr Opielka.
Mr. Opielka, I wanted to object that one should simply reopen the channels of communication. Reopen the channels of communication. The problem is what you mentioned with the arms race and the creation of enemy images and so on. You know, we also had much more extensive armament during the Cold War. At that time, the share of GDP spent on armaments and defense was in some cases even higher than it is today. But then, at the latest from 75, or especially from 75 onwards, appropriate channels and formats for dialogue were established, where alongside the ongoing hostility, people actually talked to each other. And of course, such states play a role in this today. Turkey is indeed a NATO member, but it always keeps the option open to play this mediating or bridging role. In Central and Eastern Europe, there are of course two potential candidates who currently won't play a major role, as long as this is prevented by the West and other states, namely Slovakia and Hungary. The Slovak Prime Minister, not coincidentally, offered in December of last year to host peace talks in Slovakia. So communication channels are needed. That is, so to speak, the bare minimum foundation, even if for now, only two topics, such as prisoner exchanges, are being negotiated there. This is urgently necessary, because without it, there could be a very rapid escalation of this conflict. I believe everyone, all of us, have a fundamental interest in preventing an explosion, in preventing the situation you described, Mr. Opielka. That's why those who are aware of the situation simply have to do what they can in their own circumstances, more than just voting every 4 years, but actually speaking up, voicing dissent. Anyone can do that. We did it because we live in privileged cities. We did it by publishing a second book here. But in principle, anyone can speak up, on public squares, in political parties, in church congregations, wherever.
In Kirchengemeinden, wo auch immer. Und das muss geschehen.
And that needs to happen. People must raise objections, and everyone who has an interest in the survival of this continent is called upon to do so. And for it not to survive, there is no need for nuclear weapons. If this is something I always try to remind people, consider that not a single nuclear weapon was used in Europe during World War II, yet German cities were so thoroughly destroyed throughout their entire history in a conventional war, then it must be said, anyone who cares about the survival of future generations and these European states must speak up now, or it could someday be too late.
Sonst könnte es irgendwann zu spät sein.
Diese Befürchtung habe ich eben auch. Also
I have the same concern. How can we break through the psychology and logic of this war dynamic that we are currently observing in Central Europe? And we see that it plays out somewhat differently now in France or England, but especially in the German-speaking region. What could we do, also from civil society, to establish friendship not only with Ukraine, but also to restore friendship with Russia, without arguing that Putin must be hanged in The Hague? What can we do to turn this idea of a just peace into an idea of a realistic peace? Mr. Wendler first, then Mr. Luft. No, Mr. Opielka wanted to say something.
Nee, Herr Opielka wollte was sagen. Jan, du wolltest...
Jan, you wanted to say something.
I believe the first condition is simply, what Mr. Wendler also describes well in his contribution, to begin with self-criticism, or rather to acknowledge that the world is more complex than it actually appears, and that there isn't just this one evil on one side and on the other side, those who are fighting against the problem. The main argument on our side is, we live in democratic states. This already indirectly suggests to people that democracies, by their very nature, are also more democratic, peace-loving, and so on in their foreign policy. But that's not true. So in a sense, you have to start with self-criticism and acknowledge that conflicts arise from complex causes, and that we are a part of them. I think that's the basic requirement, and I think I would emphasize that now. It's good, Stefan, Mr. Luft, that you said that. I think it really has to come from the bottom up, so it really has to arise through protests. It has to come about because people express themselves in the media, like this medium, and others. That's also one of the positive possibilities of new media, of new technology. That means there really has to be pressure from below, because these solutions won't be implemented from above. There really needs to be a large protest movement. I believe that now, too. There is no other way.
And I believe it is absolutely necessary for people to regain a sense of reality. We can only name what we think we have recognized. But the fact is, reality comes to people from the outside, even in countries like Germany. People are increasingly seeing that they are experiencing these losses in prosperity, that they have these energy costs, that they are being pushed into this warlike atmosphere. Many people notice this, and even the younger people I know are aware of it. And you can see that ultimately this also calls into question the solidarity with one's own country, the identification with one's own country, with what is happening here, with the politicians. This is ultimately being questioned.
And the
problems, what I meant at the beginning, namely the problems of the hegemon, the Western hegemonic world, let's put it that way, but also within Western societies themselves, those problems are significant. And if support for these societies ultimately disappears, then either politics acts out of fear, or at some point it becomes capable of changing course. And what one can do as an individual, you can speak out, exactly as Stefan Luft and Jan Opielka just said. That's all we can do as well. We can publish. You, Mr. Ladas, are doing a great deal with your neutrality studies. But I have the impression that internationally, on a global scale, much more is happening than in the German-speaking world. So the German mainstream media landscape is a catastrophe. That has to be said.
Eine Katastrophe, das muss man so sagen.
I think there's another point. The fact that you are now moving towards spending 5% of the gross domestic product on military and defense infrastructure means that we will be spending about 40 to 45% of the German federal budget. That is, almost every other euro, which is mainly collected through taxes, on these two areas, military and defense infrastructure. Of course, this has the consequence that areas like social services, education, and so on are massively underfunded. Someone mentioned that the Federal Republic of Germany is turning into the Military Republic of Germany. People, the citizens, will feel this, and in a very significant way. And there's perhaps another point that will come before the draft notices, namely when people realize everything is being cut. Oh, now Mr. Luft has frozen.
Herr Luft ist stecken geblieben. Ja, aber dieser Eindruck der Wirklichkeit.
Mr. Luft is stuck. Yes, but this impression of reality which he has just described, that's ultimately what it's about. That's what matters. In fact, if I may mention this, when I was preparing my contribution, I came across Samuel Huntington's book, Clash of Civilizations again. And I think Samuel Huntington already described the situation in the world very realistically back in 1996. He made it very clear that we are heading toward a world with different cultural spheres. These cultural spheres have certain characteristics, they also have confrontations, but they will have to figure out how to avoid major wars. And avoiding major wars is the crucial thing. And I think we always have to keep this necessity, this reality in mind. But there's a second point.
Immer deutlich äußern. Es gibt aber noch einen zweiten Punkt. Es ist eben auch die Frage, wenn ich in der westlichen Welt lebe.
It's also a question, when I live in the Western world, where are my actual strengths? What should I really be cultivating here? That's a thought I've especially dealt with in my contribution, that the Western world also needs to consider how it can remain attractive on a global scale. We're at risk of losing that right now. We're seeing the Western world pursue sanctions policies. These sanctions haven't been decided by the UN Security Council. We're seeing militarization. We're seeing a decline in attractiveness, for example, when the EU Commission suddenly decides what information is even considered legitimate. These are paths that will only lead us further into problems. And that's exactly what we need to reflect on. If only because I think many people recognize this and ultimately won't go along with it.
And perhaps, Mr. Luft, you were just interrupted. You're back now. What thoughts did you want to conclude with?
Dieses Land wird in den nächsten Jahren
This country will undergo fundamental transformations in the coming years, simply due to militarization and the resulting massive cuts to the welfare state, especially since phenomena and problems such as the consequences of uncontrolled migration are ongoing. We are far from creating enough housing, let alone coping with the effects of these population movements, so there will be significant upheavals. And it is quite possible that even before the first shot is fired, there will be an emergency stop. That is to be hoped for.
Notbremsung gibt. Das bleibt so offen.
I would wish for that as well. Mr. Opielka, do you have any final thoughts?
Yes, that's a good question. I have many final thoughts, but as I said, I hope that people simply become aware that we can actually say no, that we can say no to these structures that are being established, to these power structures that are driving this kind of politics, in many different ways. And I think that's the be-all and end-all. And I increasingly believe that rules can only come from there, as I mentioned earlier. And following from that, my hope is that this awareness truly develops in all European countries, not just in Germany, but in all European countries.
I hope so too. And that's also the point where we, those of us who write books and speak publicly, can keep telling others, you are allowed to say no to militarization. You can also say, I simply don't believe you, you lunatics. Even if you're sitting in the Bundestag and shouting from the podium, we have to go to war. Then you should go first. Please, you go first. But don't send our children. Gentlemen, your book is now available in bookstores. It was published by West End Verlag and is called With Russia for a Change in Policy. I'll put the information in the description of this video.
Vielen herzlichen Dank.
Thank you very much for your time today.
Wir danken Ihnen.
Thank you.
Ja,
Thank you to you as well.
vielen Dank an Sie.